This is the student panel, and without further ado, I will actually pass it to our first presenter, Shahir.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me as a panelist and as a speaker for this conference. So basically, the paper I have intended to present is the Taiwan as a geopolitical gamble. So in this paper, I am arguing about the pacing challenge of China and the potential fate of Taiwan. As we all know that China's rise has become a pacing challenge that has driven the US policymakers to rethink about the pacing scenario of its primary warfighting mission to conquer Taiwan. So in past, China lacked offensive military capabilities and also the required industrial military base to overpower Taiwan and realize its long-held goal of national rejuvenation. And also such a military operation at that time involved a higher risk due to the presence of the US Navy 7th Fleet in Japan. However, as the regional military balance is steadily transforming in the Chinese favor, several analysts are skeptic that could China be deterred to seize Taiwan by force or not? Because according to many analysts, particularly the Michel Bachelet, who is a very prominent sinologist, he considered Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which could enable China's power projection in the Western Pacific. Also, many of the analysts have considered it as a cork in the bottle, which is likened to be bottling the Chinese expansion in the Western Pacific. So it implies that Taiwan is a center of gravity in the East Asian conundrum. So keeping in view that PLA's enhanced military capabilities, China attained several options at its disposal to capture Taiwan. Chinese defense papers have outshined and outlined several options at their disposal to be utilized in their potential course of invasion. It includes volleys of certain aerial and missile attacks, which aims at the naval, aerial, and missile batteries of Taiwan. Similarly, China can also force coercion on Taiwan by throttling its economy by enforcing a naval blockade. And there is also an option of amphibious assault, which is combined with strategic bombing, which is intended to destroy the command and control of the Taiwanese armed forces. However, I argue that despite the overestimation of the PLA's operational capabilities, their manpower, their cyber power, their network-centric warfare capabilities, there are several constraints on the Chinese course of invasion, which I will discuss later. Basically, firstly, talking about the regional military balance. The military balance around the strait is gradually shifting in the Chinese favor. The increased anti-access and area denial capabilities has enabled PLA to keep the US forces at bay with a greater chance during the conflict. Contrarily to the past, PLA is now able to seize what we call as three dominances: localized command of seas, it may be command of the air, and also the command of information. Chinese strategists have termed this condition as localized war under the informatized conditions. So PLA has modernized its arsenal of standoff firepower. They have integrated ballistic missiles, they have integrated rockets, cruise missiles, and also air-to-surface missiles in the last 3 decades. So according to one report I have came across, which was the annual report to Congress 2020, it stated that the asymmetrical gap has made Taiwan vulnerable to the missile strikes by China. So China has armed its naval vessels with electromagnetic railguns, and also their guided missile destroyers and nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, and notably the upcoming Chinese Jin-class submarines is also a modernization in the existing PLA's naval fleet. Moving towards the Taiwan's capabilities, if we consider Taiwan defense capabilities, they are particularly lying upon the sea denial capabilities, in which Taiwanese attack crafts and anti-ship launchers are significant in deterring People Liberation Army Navy's surface vessels, which are aiming for the amphibious assault to capture the island. However, there are several arguments by the scholars that these defenses are also vulnerable to the Chinese assault, particularly the standoff missile power. Taiwan's anti-landing campaigns and anti-landing abilities are seeming to be more realistic because they are able to achieve the conscription and the island's geography. So, however, the existing literature have also doubted the Chinese and Taiwanese anti-landing capabilities. I will outline 3 of the main course of action which are outlined in the Chinese defense papers to achieve the fait accompli over Taiwan. First is the surprise aerial and missile attacks. Second is the amphibious invasion. And third is the naval blockade. Firstly, if we come towards the surprise aerial and missile attacks, the PLA strategic echelon is considering the surprise aerial and missile attack as the foremost campaign in invading Taiwan. The PLA's Science of Joint Operation documents elaborates the order of airstrike campaign, which start with the electronic operations intended to damage the enemy's command and control centers, and also the early warning radars, which includes the air defense system that will enable the missile strikes and ensure the freedom of maneuvers to the People Liberation Army Air Force. PLA may also strike in this regard the Taiwanese tactical assets, including the armored vehicles and also the artillery systems. So after decimating these Taiwanese defensive assets, PLA may further destroy the war potential of Taiwan. So the aim of the surprise aerial and missile attack is to completely decimate the Taiwanese forces before they can retaliate and strike back. So this tactic is the only hope for the PLA to constitute their aerial and naval supremacy across the strait, because without decimating the Taiwanese air defenses and their missile forces, it is impossible for China to carry out a successful amphibious assault over the island. However, if we introspect this scenario raised several doubts due to Taiwan's military capabilities. Taiwan is housing one of the best world early warning systems, which includes fixed early warning radars, ground mobile radars. They have E-2 Hawkeye aircrafts, and also they have the satellite intelligence provided by the United States. So in case of any invasion, Taiwan naval arsenals and the fighter aircraft can operate from nearly 36 dispersed bases in the island. And some of these locations are built in the hangars inside the mountains, while others are safeguarded by 6 feet concrete thick walls. So in case PLA missiles have damaged the runways at the airfield, the Taiwanese air forces might operate from the civilian air bases and also the highways. So in the meantime, Taiwan's runway repair teams are having the best record in the world of repairing the damaged runway. Moreover, there is also a scenario that Taiwan possesses long-range SAM missile launchers and the road mobile anti-aircraft guns. So in order, Taiwan is intending to carry out an offensive strike on the mainland. They have cruise missile launchers, they have SRBM launchers, they have underground storages, they have also the howitzer artillery that is being stationed in the Matsu and the Jinmen Islands, which is a few miles away from China. Also, if we examine the historical patterns, if we see that the initial airstrikes, how these modern firepower strikes have viability, we can see the examples from Vietnam, we can see the example from Afghanistan, and we can also see the example of the Gulf War, where the US and the allies have pummeled the Iraq by nearly 88,000 pounds of munitions and targeted the Iraqi airfields. However, the initial Iraqi airfields and their missile launchers survived the initial aerial assault. There is also an example of the Serbian air defenses, where in 1999, NATO has pummeled the Serbian air defenses with nearly 7,000 tons of ordnance. But initially, it was unable to overpower or neutralize all of the Serbian air defenses in this regard. So in case of Taiwan, they are much stronger than Serbia, and they have much more than Serbia and Iraq had to offer. So if China is to attacking them, they might face even more significant and stringent challenges than the US did in Iraq. So in this age of hyper-real information, if China is attacking Taiwan, the images of the Chinese bombing could rally the international support for Taiwan, which can leave China vulnerable to the international sanctions. Now I am coming towards the second option, that is the amphibious assault. If China has successfully carried out the aerial and missile attacks, ideally, then it could pave the way for its impeding amphibious invasion. So if we talk about the amphibious invasion, it is a critical and the notorious mission that is very difficult to undertake. The amphibious invasion requires 3 conditions. First is that the attacker, that is the PLA, should have an aerial superiority over the opponent forces. Secondly, the ground forces, which are mobilized by the attacker, must outnumber the opponent forces upon landing. And lastly, and the most importantly, the attacker must establish an effective beachhead to carry out an assault. So historically, there are many examples of amphibious invasion in the World War II and in the Korean War, which were successfully carried out by the Allies, but it also suffered the huge material and the potential losses. So if we speak theoretically, Presently, China is housing more than 100 amphibious warships, and if all of them have survived their trip across the strait, then the PLA is able to land troops and also the mobilized vehicles on the Taiwan shores. On the other hand, if we view the Taiwan's capabilities, Taiwan is having nearly 150,000 active troops and 1.5 million reservists, which can enable Taiwan theoretically to station more defenders than China's whole amphibious fleet. So if we view towards the other obstacles, Taiwan's geography is also an impeding hurdle for the Chinese troops, because east coast of the Taiwan is consisting of the ridges and rocks and also the rocky terrain, where PLA fleet might confront the torrent seas, attack from the Taiwanese ships, fighter aircraft, and the shore-based missile batteries. If we come towards the west coast, there is also a stringent scenario, because there are marshes, there are mud flats, because if in the marshes and in the mud flats, PLA must need to avoid getting trapped. And if it need to avoid getting trapped, it need to land on the few available high tide locations, which will make the amphibious fleet a sitting duck for the Taiwanese troops. The third crucial element, which can create difficulties for China, is amassing more troops in Taiwan. And I have mentioned that Taiwan has advantage in this regard, because it can amass more troops and more defenders as compared to the amphibious invading forces of the PLA. Most of the strategists have also attributed towards abilities of the special operation forces of PLA, but I will like to cite the report of the US Navy War College, which has highlighted the several deficiencies in the critical areas of special operation forces of PLA, which includes the strategic airlift and absence of the proper mechanism in coordination between brigade level forces and also the Eastern Command theaters. Now, in this regard, if we see the amphibious assault and its viability, we can see that there is an element of fragility in the PLA's course of invasion, and Chinese naval losses will be of the far greater extent, and as it will be operating a few hundred miles in the Taiwanese Strait and will be under the range of the Taiwanese artillery. Last option I am introspecting is the naval blockade. Naval blockade is basically a stringent option for the PLA at their disposal to quarantine Taiwan. So the science of campaigns, their documents describe the main aim of the blockade campaign over Taiwan is to isolate the enemy's island from the outer world, which will jeopardize the enemy's will to fight and the will to resolve. In this scenario, China is likely to impose a limited blockade or may deploy the Coast Guard or the PLA Navy to inspect and block the maritime and commercial traffic towards the island. In this scenario, several aggressive ways are at the disposal of China. The most bellicose approach is to destroy Taiwanese aerial and naval assets, their commercial ports, their oil terminals in a surprise aerial or the missile attack that has been discussed before. So later on, if we see the course of action of PLA, it will likely to dispatch submarines to sink the cargo ships and lay mines around the Taiwanese docks. So ideally, there's an ideal situation if all of the aerial strikes have disgruntled the offensive forces and the defensive assets of Taiwan. Taiwanese economy will face a serious recession, and it will lose the ability to unload the cargo ships and containers on its ports. However, these dire circumstances also make the chances of the Taiwanese submission to Beijing very skeptic, because the historical pattern suggests that no naval blockade in the past 200 years have forced any state to surrender its sovereignty. The rationale behind my argument is that the modern states know how to adapt to the situation and how the civilian probability to resolve is high. So historically, the United States has also conducted a most comprehensive blockade under the Operation Starvation. And this blockade reduced the Japanese imports by 97%. And also, it was having a severe impact on the Japanese economy. But Japan only surrendered after obliteration of its military, leveling of its large cities, and also suffering the two nuclear attacks from the US forces. So in case of Taiwan, PLA need to falter this historical trend. And in order to falter this historical trend, China requires weak-willed Taiwanese citizens, which are more inclined towards the unification with the mainland. However, if we view several surveys and several studies in which we can see the inclination of Taiwanese, we can find that a large number and a significant portion of Taiwanese are not or do not like to associate themselves with mainland. Instead, they are more comfortable and more confident in associating themselves with their Taiwanese identity. So these scenarios make these situations challenging for the People Liberation Army. So lastly, I may conclude my argument that it's clear that China has risen as a significant challenger and also a pacing security concern for the United States policymakers. And the military balance and the regional military balance is also steadily and gradually transforming in Chinese favor. And China's ongoing military modernization, their military doctrines, their doctrinal patterns are changing, and they have also improved their equipments and also have commissioned modern technologies, emerging and disruptive technologies. These factors could escalate tensions and potentially lead towards a limited conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. But considering Chinese increased military capabilities and various strategies, there are several ways which I have discussed that Chinese may utilize to invade Taiwan and achieve a fait accompli. But in this interdependent world, these actions will be a double-edged sword for China, because many of the factors are not favoring the Chinese PLA's course of invasion, because Taiwan is also having a very good portion in contributing to the semiconductor industry, and possibly disrupting the semiconductor chain will also cause problems for PLA and also cause problem for China as well as for the world. So it is very pretty much elusive to say that the Taiwan is a very easy piece of cake for the PLA. So I conclude this study that despite China has substantial manpower, they have substantial cyber power, they have substantial network-centric warfare capabilities, and also the missile technology, taking Taiwan remains a challenging goal. So in a sense, I can say that it's like reaching a shore that is too far away for the Chinese in their pursuit of what they call is as national rejuvenation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahir. I'm going to postpone questions for now. You made a lot of really interesting and really great points, especially when you talk about air superiority, Air Force officers, so I'm very curious about these. To respect all the other panelists' time, though, I want to hear what they also have to say. So, Aditya from the New Mexico University, we'll have you go next.
Okay, I just had one simple question. Am I allowed to share in my PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared for this?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
If you could give me the permission, I could share it with you all.
Yeah, you can share it.
Thank you. Is it visible?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So hello everyone. My name is Aditya. I generally go by Adi, just to keep it plain and simple. So my research topic is about the Chagos sovereignty dispute between the United Kingdom and Mauritius and its implications for India. So to briefly tell you about what's going on in Chagos right now, that before Mauritius gained its independence in 1968, a small territory called the Chagos Archipelago, which was a part of the Crown Colony of Mauritius, that was administered by the British, was excised in 1965, citing UK and US pressure to in the part of the strategic island concept developed by the United States Army, the United States Navy. But ever since Mauritius got its independence in 1968, it has been wanting to regain sovereignty over the islands. And recently, in the ICJ advisory opinion that was passed in favor of Mauritius, all the UNGA members voted in favor of Mauritius to regain sovereignty over the islands. So my first question is, why is the Chagos Archipelago so important? So this is briefly the location of the Chagos Archipelago, which is somewhere around 1,800 kilometers south of India in the southern hemisphere. And there are somewhere around 55 to 60 islands. But the most important island is the island of Diego Garcia, which houses quite a lot of military facilities and military equipment that are useful for the United States to maintain the balance in the Indian Ocean and its primacy in the Indian Ocean. So there are two things when it comes to the Chagos Archipelago. The first one is the Chagos Archipelago as a whole and the naval support facility at Diego Garcia. So the naval support facility at Diego Garcia hosts both the United States Navy and the Air Force. It has quite a lot of communication facilities established since 1971, a fully operational airstrip, harbor for United States ships and submarines, both nuclear and conventional, and quite a lot of military stockpiling with food and ammunition. But the real issue with Chagos when it comes to international institutions is the ILOA or the Chagosian community. So the ILOA are the indigenous community or the native community that have been residing on the islands that were due to from colonial times. Number one, they were brought in as coconut planters by the colonial administration, first the French and then the British. But when the British excised the islands from the Crown Colony of Mauritius in 1965, much of the population, I would say all of the population, was forcibly removed from the islands. And ever since then, the Chagosian population has been fighting to get back to the islands or and Mauritius is wanting to gain sovereignty back over the islands since they consider it as their integral territory. So my question has been, what is the role of India when it comes to the Chagos sovereignty dispute? Number one, India, ever since its independence, India as a second wave democracy, it has been in support of Mauritian sovereignty claims over Chagos. And subsequent Indian administrations, be it under the Indian National Congress or the Bharatiya Janata Party or the Third Front, that was in power between 1977 to 1980, have opposed the naval support facility at Diego Garcia in the Chagos Archipelago. Recently, India voted in favor of the UNGA resolution citing 1514, which claims which wants the independence of colonial countries and the peoples. But there are quite a lot of connotations that I'm arguing in my paper or my master's thesis that are related to India's position when it comes to supporting Mauritian sovereignty claims over Chagos. My first hypothesis, or the null hypothesis, how I see it, is India's support of Mauritius results from its foreign policy objectives, that is the opposition to colonialism and strengthening international institutions, or something called as the Nehruvian policies of idealism after India gained its independence. The methodology that I'm using for this research is technically mixed methods. For qualitative, I'm using publicly available documents and audiovisual material, be it with research papers, newspaper articles since 1965, open source government documents from the United Kingdom, the United States, Mauritius, and India, secondary interviews and speeches that are publicly available on YouTube and also on Hansard, the United Kingdom Parliament website, and the legislative debates within India and from in Mauritius. As for quantitative data, I'm relying more on military equipment comparison between the United States, United Kingdom, India, and Mauritius, and the amount of funds that the states are expending when it comes to acquiring arms and arms transfers. So for this particular research, I have 4 chapters. To briefly tell you, I describe the history of the Chagos Archipelago and where the current situation currently lies, because the United Kingdom has certainly began negotiations with the Mauritian government to cede sovereignty back to Chagos. But there are 2 schools of thought when it comes to ceding back the sovereignty over Chagos to either Mauritius or keeping the sovereignty for the United Kingdom. But I'm using the framework by Donald E. Neuchterlein, who happened to be a US diplomat and a professor of political science, who passed at a ripe old age of 97 last year. He wrote a paper called National Interest and Foreign Policy, a conceptual framework for the analysis and decision making. So technically, I am relying on the realist school of thought, where foreign policy is always to pursue national interests. So how Neuchterlein has described foreign policy and national interests is something as national interests are divided into 4 parts, that is defense, economic, world order, and ideological. For defense interests, it is to protect the state and its citizens from external aggression or threat. For economic interests, it is always about enhancing a state's economic well-being with other states. World order interests are maintaining international political and economic system for a state to feel secure to act with other states peacefully. And lastly, it is the ideological interest, which is to protect and promote value that a state's people share and believe to be universally good. But he does not stop at that. He has also called something as the intensity of interest, which is further divided into 4 parts, which is survival, vital interest, major issues, and peripheral issues. For survival issues is when the existence of the state altogether is challenged physically, which means if the state's sovereignty and territorial integrity is challenged. Number two is vital issues are when severe damage is likely to a state, and if not curbed, that can become a survival issue. Major issues when a state's economic, political, and ideological interests are threatened due to the events unfolding in the international environment. And if no corrective action is taken, the issue can become a vital one. And lastly, these are the peripheral issues are when a state's well-being is not affected, but the events in the unfolding in the international system or its private citizens or companies are endangered. There is quite a lot of elaboration when it comes to value factors and cost factors, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you an example after how the Chagos archipelago was completely detached from the crown colony of Mauritius, what each state's interest and the intensity of interest and where they lied. I'm speaking about three states, and I'll be applying the same framework to my research to understand India's interests or national interests when it comes to the Chagos archipelago sovereignty dispute. So in this table, you'll be able to see that the defense interest of both the United States, United Kingdom, and Mauritius were peripheral because there was no direct threat to their physical security or their territorial integrity when it comes to the excision of Chagos. But for economic interest, the reason why the United States and the United Kingdom got together to excise Chagos was due to the strategic island concept that was promoted by the United States Navy after the British withdrew east of Suez in 1956. It was to protect the oil import that the Western economies depended on. For Mauritius, after independence, their economy was quite dependent upon the Western world and the socialist world because it wanted to become a part of the European Economic Community and also had economic relations with China and with the Soviet Union of that time. As for world order interests, it was the same for the United States and the UK, that is to protect their for the sorry, I think my mic went off there. Sorry. So yeah, for the world order interests of the United States and the United Kingdom, it was the same. And for Mauritius, they were major issues because they were highly dependent upon their economy and their political well-being when it comes to the protection of their lands. Until 1974, Mauritius had a treaty with the United Kingdom to provide the country with external and internal security. But when it comes to ideological issues, both the United States, United Kingdom, and Mauritius, they were vital issues, but on opposite ends. For the United States and the United Kingdom, it was the deterrence of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism in the third world. But for Mauritius, it was about to gain sovereignty back to the Chagos archipelago. So I have put India's national interests in Mauritius into three categories. Number one is economic, given the fact that India and Mauritius is the highest foreign direct investor in India. And recently, the BJP government in India signed a comprehensive economic cooperation partnership agreement in 2021. Mauritius and India are also part of the IORA and the Security and Growth for All, a brainchild of the current Prime Minister of India. But for as far as the ideological interests are concerned, India has technically opposed the naval support facility at Diego Garcia, but there is tangible evidence to prove that it has bandwagon with Western powers when it comes to the Indian Ocean, when it comes to security in the Indian Ocean, and to provide security for itself from any challenges or survival issues that would arise in the Indian Ocean. But I call something called as the grand strategic interests that are happening in India, which is called technically defense and world order issues. After the British withdrew and the Royal Navy withdrew from Mauritius in 1974, the INC-led government almost launched a military invasion or a military intervention called Lal Dora in Mauritius. And it also operates some surveillance facilities from the Mauritius islands of Rodrigues, San Brandon, and Agalega. So its grand strategy interests in the Indian Ocean are quite vital. But as far as ideologically it is concerned, it is more related to how the international environment reacts to the Chagos sovereignty dispute. That's the reason why I put ideological interest into the major issue. As far as the peripheral interests of India are concerned, they have no defense issues going on with Mauritius, and that's the reason why it's peripheral. India is wanting to protect its economic and grand strategic interests in Mauritius. So at the end, I'm in a way trying to refute the null hypothesis, which I showed you earlier on, that India is just supporting Mauritius because of its decolonization rhetoric and support of the UNGA resolution 1514. My alternate hypothesis one is India is seeking its preeminence in the Indian Ocean. And the second hypothesis is India seeks to deter the increasing influence of the PRC in the Indian Ocean. So the objective here is how or if the naval support facility of Diego Garcia fits in India's interests. However, there are a few drawbacks and additions that I'd like to make before I conclude this presentation. This is a very realist understanding of IR, and I am, if not overlooking, but undermining the impacts of domestic politics and foreign policy objectives of when states pursue their national interests. So if I would like to add something to this research, it is about how the domestic politics of Mauritius and the domestic politics of India affects its foreign policy objectives when it comes to the Western Indian Ocean. Also, this research explicitly focuses on Indo-Mauritius bilateral relationships rather than India's relations with Western Indian Ocean states. So this is something that I would consider to be a drawback and would like to work on after my master's thesis. With that, I'd like to conclude and I'm willing to take all questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is an interesting presentation purely because I don't get to hear a whole lot about the Indian Ocean, especially in kind of who I talk about. We mostly focus on South China Sea and kind of like the Western Pacific. So it is refreshing to hear about the Indian Ocean. So I know you're ready for questions, but we're going to still keep those towards the end because we have a couple of other panelists still. So I'm actually going to move on to RANIA.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for inviting me for the student panel of this of the annual consortium conference. So my name is Rayhana. I'm also a student from American Asia-Pacific University, and I'm going to do a little presentation on my research, which is Indonesia's position on U.S.-China conflict. So a little brief history of like what is going on in the between U.S. and China. So China have been asserting aggressive claim over the South China Sea and the East China Sea, which violated the territorial integrity of Indo-Pacific nations and also threatening the peace and security of the entire region. So given that situation, the U.S. entered the Indo-Pacific region to respond to China's aggression and enhance their military presence in the region, but that only increased the vulnerability of the Indo-Pacific region. So given that Indonesia is located at the edge of the South China Sea, it has put Indonesia in a very vulnerable position, given that Indonesia is very cautious and their engagement with both China and the United States, sidestepping any political decision that may provoke either states, so they remain neutral in this U.S.-China competition. But as the leading power of in Southeast Asia, both China and the United States seeks Indonesia's support in their geopolitical competition, which calls into question Indonesia's neutral stance. So Indonesia's strategy of neutrality is actually underlined by the concept of free and active diplomacy, which essentially means that Indonesia is non-aligned in any international conflicts and major power blocs. This specific foreign policy strategy is aimed to have a million friends and zero enemies, so Indonesia can reap the benefits of an active relations with all nations. So in accordance with the free and active policy, Indonesia remains neutral in the U.S.-China rivalry and maintains the relations with both Washington and Beijing. Starting off with their economic relations, so U.S. and Indonesia economic relations began in the 1980s, and the United States became Indonesia's second largest trading partner in the 1990s, with trade volume reaching over $1 billion in 1990 alone, which is a very significant amount given the inflation rate at that time. Now, the current trade volume reached $1 billion every year. But in comparison, China-Indonesian economic relations stretch back since the 1950s, but compared to the United States, the trade was relatively small in the 1990s, but it continues to expand throughout the years. But right now, just this year alone, 2023, Indonesia's total exports to China already reached $5 billion. This is because of the establishment of the Indonesia and China strategic partnership, which has strengthened China's position as Indonesia's largest trading partner. So as their trading relations grew, their relations also expanded as well. Indonesia and China signed the Belt and Roads Initiative in 2017, which essentially means that China will be providing Indonesia with financial support and also human resources support to help Indonesia to build their infrastructure in across many Indonesian provinces. So the total infrastructure investment is estimated to exceed $90 billion across 28 projects. And recently, I think the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway has just finished. With that project alone already exceeds $7 billion. And given that China became the second largest investor in Indonesia with over $25 billion investment. But when we're talking about military cooperation, I think Indonesia and China military ties seems very impossible, given that China has actually violated Indonesia's sovereignty before in 2021 when China demanded to stop Indonesia's oil drilling because they claim that it is within the so-called 9-dash line. But and also China's incursion of the South China Sea, which put pressures on Indonesian national security. So given that Indonesia and the United States have a long-standing defense ties since 2006, where they have joint defense and security activities in transnational threats, providing foreign military financing and international military education and training, but they're shifting their focus now to deter China's forces from Indonesia's maritime territory. The U.S. have invested $3.5 million in military training center and naval base in Batam. It is an island in Indonesia, which is the closest, which borders at the South China Sea. So given the preceding discussion, I think it shows that neutrality allows Indonesia to reap the economic and military benefits from China and the United States. But also, given that the conflict is still ongoing to this date, I think it puts an increasing concern that the conflict may extend to Indonesia's territorial border. That's why 60% of Indonesia believe that their country should join the US to deter China's power. But that idea seems so far-fetched because Indonesia's economy is highly dependent on China. I mean, based on the previous discussion, China is the largest Indonesia's largest trading partner and also the second largest investor to the country. So maintaining a good relationship with China is very critical for Indonesia's economy. I mean, taking Australia as an example, where China imposes trade ban on Australia because Australia wanted to do an independent research on the origin of COVID-19. So Australia accidentally offended China, and given that China imposed a trade ban on them. And similar to Indonesia, Australia is also an economic province of China. So China's trade ban to Australia affected the country $600 million in trade. And with that, even Australia have a more developed economy than Indonesia. So if that happened, the same thing happens to Indonesia, Indonesia might suffer greater consequences for provoking China. So I think it is wiser that Indonesia avoid any entanglements in the rivalry, but maybe also urging a peaceful settlement. And that is exactly what Indonesia is doing. So Indonesia's neutral stand has encouraged both China and the United States first meeting during the 2022 G20 summit, where initially a lot of state members of the G20 boycotted the summit because of Russia's presence. But Indonesia's good relations with state members actually encouraged China's and the United States' first meeting ever. So and President Joko Widodo said the G20 meeting helped cool down US-China tensions, where they both agreed to improve their strained relations and cooperating to address global issues such as debt relief, food security, and climate change. So this is what President Joko Widodo said after the G20 summit, where competition and rivalries are normal. What is important is to keep them under control and don't let them turn into an open conflict. Big countries have the shared responsibility to preserve stability and peace in the region and globally, which means that they should communicate and meet often. So given that, I think the conflict would most likely still continue. But I think unless things drastically deteriorated, remaining neutral is the most strategic approach for Indonesia right now, which allowed them to reap the benefits of interstate cooperation and being a mediation between rivals. But I do agree with that to a certain level, but because I think Indonesia should also ease their economic dependency with China, while also trying to build their own military power, because worst case scenario, if a conflict do occur, given that Indonesia is not a major ally of the United States or a NATO member, I don't think the United States would support Indonesia militarily. So maybe trying to build their independent military power by cooperating with fellow ASEAN members, because they are also facing the similar dilemma. And yeah, that is all for now for my presentation.
Thank you so much. Another presentation where I have a lot of questions. I appreciate your perspective, especially for the Indonesian perspective. I don't get to hear that very often, so the presentation is beyond interesting. Juan, I see that you rejoined, so I will withhold my questions again, even though it pains me to do so. But I am very eager to hear your presentation as well, so I'll turn it over to Juan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I think there's some problem with my internet. Okay, I think, is that okay for now?
Yep, we can hear you. You're good.
Oh, okay, perfect. So I don't prepare any slide, but I will try to briefly use my speaking to talk about my article. So my article is briefly discuss the current situation of the telecommunication fraud on the China-Myanmar border by sorting out the origin and development, operating, and impact of it to draw attention. And finally, I give some recommendations and solutions, but if we have time, we can talk about more. So first is a definition and origin of the telecommunication fraud. Here I quote the provisions of Article 2 of Chapter 1 of the Anti-Telecom and Network Fraud Law of the People's Republic of China, which was adopted in September 2022. It says, a telecom and online fraud means the act of fraudulently obtaining public or private property by telecommunication network technologies through remote, non-contact, and other methods for the purpose of illegal possession. The difference between telecom and online fraud and general fraud is that it's through the use of telecommunication network technology means. The telecom fraud first appeared in Taiwan in the 1990s, and by 2000, it had become the mainstream of fraud cases on the island and was rampant for a while. As the Taiwan authorities intensified their crackdowns, fraud groups began to move their industrials overseas, which coincided with the increasingly frequent cross-strait exchanges. And around 2002, Taiwan's mobile phone business established a signal station in Fujian, it's a southern province in China. And this has also opened a door to a new world for telecom fraudsters in Taiwan. They took advantages of the lack of mutual legal assistance provisions between the two sides at the same time, set up a communication equipment room in Fuzhou, and Fuzhou is a city belongs to Fujian province, continued to defraud by making phone calls and gradually turned their targets to the broader mainland market. According to the data, these Taiwanese fraud groups operate in the name of Taiwanese companies, employing local people to act as messengers to make scam calls and withdraw money. In addition to fraud method, these messengers have also learned how to avoid detection of telecommunications and conduct the bank fund transfer. As the police focused on cracking down on the Fujian area, the fraud gang fled to Shenzhen, the city near to the Fujian province. At the same time, Shenzhen was crowded with young people from all over the country looking for money-making opportunities, provided a good time for telecom fraud to expand the scope. And later, telecom fraud spread like a virus across country. Around 2010, under the high pressure of the Chinese police, the fraud syndicates in Taiwan and mainland China chose to flee en masse, recruiting people from home and setting up new fraud dens in South Asia, Central and South America, even Europe. Their footprints even spread to countries such as Middle East and United Arab Emirates, using different regions and barriers between countries to escape blows. So this is a very simple background of the telecom fraud, how its resources and originated. And why the telecom frauders, they chose Myanmar recently. Since Myanmar's independence in the 1948, differences in demand and distribution of rights and resources surrounding national constructions have resulted in conflicts between the central government and ethnic minorities' armed forces have continued to these days. In this process, in order to support armed survival activities, many local armed forces turned to illegal industrials as a source of income. In order to combat ethnic local armed forces, the central government army has also formed various ethnic group armed forces and allowed them to engage in illegal activities, which has allowed the underground economy in Myanmar to develop. Although local authorities in Myanmar are aware of the telecommunication fraud network in the region, they even send guards to provide security for some of these kind of companies in states. And another reason is due to China and Myanmar are adjacent to each other in the north, cross-border trade is frequent. Many residents of Yunnan province in southwestern China and northern Myanmar speak the same language and frequently travel between the two countries, making it easy for telecom fraud networks to gain access to human resources. Benefit from such geographical and cultural advantages, many Chinese people go to northern Myanmar hoping to find money-making opportunities after their business has failed. Many of them were smuggled to northern Myanmar by some labor agencies or matchmaking agencies, and participated in telecom fraud crimes under the violent coercion of criminal gangs. There are also many Chinese-owned businesses that serve as middlemen for fraudulent activities, helping to process remittances and withdrawals. And these companies profit from handling fees. Cash flow from the illegal industry has fueled a boom in restaurants and related business in northern Myanmar. In recent years, Chinese public security agencies have launched joint law enforcement operations with Cambodia, Philippines, and Laos, pushing criminals involved in fraud further into northern Myanmar and turning it into a hotbed for cross-border crime. Significantly, after Myanmar enacted a gambling law in 2019, the legalizing foreign invested casinos, gambling-type telecom fraud networks become more active in northern Myanmar. So this may be an interesting phenomenon that the northern Myanmar telecom fraud actually quite related to the gambling industry. The telecom fraud and online gambling industry are inextricably related, but because the gambling telecom fraud is the most common type in northern Myanmar, and fraudsters will interfere with the winning or losing result of gambling by modifying background data on the website. After the victim has no more resources of money, a higher interest low business is launched. Violent means to collect debts after the victim is unable to repay are frequently used, and the victim even forced to donate blood to repay debts. According to the Myanmar's gambling law 2019, a casino refers to the place or building only allows foreigners to gamble and is registered with the permission of the union government. With the passage of the law, casinos will not be allowed to operate, albeit with government-mandated terms and conditions. This will open the doors to foreign investors and tourists. On the other hand, all forms of gambling are illegal under Chinese law. And if Chinese citizens want to place bets using offshore online gambling sites, The first hurdle is making a deposit on a gambling platform. Therefore, to successfully launder money, gambling operations often utilize leading e-commerce platforms and courier companies to facilitate large-scale financial transactions disguised as legitimate online shopping transactions. And another way to deposit money into online gambling sites is through mobile top-ups. The transactions were disguised as normal bill increases on mobile phone accounts, but were actually funneling funds to gambling sites. Like G platform also be used as money laundering channel, which will provide contractor and payroll services to employers in the food delivery, ride-hailing, and e-commerce industries. And since 2018, more than 10,000 such platforms have emerged in China. In 2020, the Hunan Xintan branch of the Agriculture Bank of China discovered suspicious transactions with a gig-work human resources supplier. The company had more than 200 billion yuan in cash transactions in just a dozen days. And the police discovered the company was laundering money for telecommunications fraud syndicates. These company platforms are called benchmark platforms. And because of time limitation, so I will skip the legal crackdown from the Chinese government and talk about the global impact of these fraud activities. Since many participants in telecommunication fraud are from China, and this is not good for its international image from my perspective, and is a topic that can be distorted and exploited with regards to the Chinese government. This type of the crime is being interpreted by the media or individuals with conspiracy theories as a political policy or Chinese development, which will harm the Chinese development path. And the campaigns carried out by China and Southeast Asia countries is helping reduce the number of citizens around the world who are scammed. That's because fraudsters are not just targeting Chinese-speaking people, they are also recruiting people from places like South America and Europe to extend their victim base around the world. It is known that North Myanmar districts many targets Chinese victims, while Myanmar gang in southern Myanmar actually targets people from Europe and the US. However, due to the squeeze on living space, this also risks forcing the center of the fraud to shift from Asian to other regions. Yes, that's all. Thank you for the listening.
All right, thank you. So put a pin in that because I'm going to return to you in just a second. I'm actually going to aim the first question at Shahir since he was the first that went. Shahir, you still there?
Yes, I am still there.
Perfect. Okay. So to remind me, I guess to remind the audience, you talked a lot about amphibious tactics, and so unfortunately, one of my compatriots, Grant Willis, is not here. That's one of his big things. But the military capabilities that you were talking about for China is kind of what I wanted to focus on. So aside from the advanced capabilities that the People's Liberation Army Navy has, do you think that that blockade that you were talking about can still be effective, even considering that the People's Liberation Army Navy is truly more of a coastal defense navy at this point in time? Do you think that a blockade would be able to stop a coalition assault to then push the Chinese out of Taiwan?
Brendan, it is a very insightful question. If we talk about the blockade, it is a multi-pronged strategy that is being pursued that will be likely to pursued by PLA in the near course if they could invade Taiwan. But if we talk about the blockade to be effective, they require several factors. In case of Taiwan, if PLA is basically enforcing a blockade, they could not be able to deprive Taiwan from all of their needs, whether they are having their commercial needs, whether they are having their economic and monetary needs, because Taiwan will still be able to ferry their cargoes with the small tankers, with ferries, and also their ships will be able to operate even in the war condition under the Taiwanese flag. Moreover, if we see in the wartime situations, there are many companies and there are many firms which are being able to operate in the wartime zones and wartime areas. And secondly, if PLAN is effectively trying to effectively enforce a blockade, it will still face a challenge from the geography, because Taiwan, because the coalition forces, they will not be China will not be keep them at bay for many longer. But how does it will play, or how does it will translate into practical terms? It depends upon the will of the coalition members, and particularly the United States. I was reading Elbridge A. Colby. He has mentioned the sequential strategy that is being pursued by China in case of Taiwan. In this scenario, they are basically singling out all the coalition members, trying to single out them and then isolate them, and then they are trying to degrade the efficiency of the coalition. So if we talk about the naval block, if we talk about that, will China be able to keep them at bay or not, it depends upon the will and the resolve of the coalition members. As far as in case of Taiwan is concerned, I have mentioned the capabilities, I have mentioned the constraints on the PLA's course of invasion over Taiwan, and also how Taiwan can basically make its way out in case of any invasion, whether it is blockade, whether it is amphibious assault, or whether it is a strategic bombing or aerial and missile attacks.
For the sake of time, I could ask more questions, but I think I have to limit it just to one. But thank you very much for answering that question.
Welcome.
Adita, I think you're up next. I think you went second. So you talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, something that to myself is very interesting. I guess it's a little bit of a two-part question, and with the Belt and Road Initiative, do you see that the expansion of the BRI in the Indian Ocean is going to impact the capability for India and the United States to counter Chinese influence in that area?
I would say so, yes, because I'm focusing more on the security aspects of it, but I think I'd be able to answer that question really, because in my hypothesis 2 and hypothesis 3, that the alternative hypotheses I spoke about, I am saying that India is seeking its preeminence in the Indian Ocean. And by preeminence, it has to deter the rise of China, given the fact that in Maldives, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and in other states that India considers under its own sphere of influence, the impact of China is growing greater when it comes to extending loans, or probably signing treaties or signing economic partnerships with states in the Indian Ocean, especially with Mauritius, with Seychelles, and with Maldives. So as you have seen, there were the presidential elections in Maldives, and the guy who was elected recently has not been very pro-India like the former president of Maldives. So how India is going to tackle that, and how the partnership with India, the quadrilateral security dialogue, India's own bilateral relationship with states like France, the United Kingdom, and the United States will affect India's preeminence in the Indian Ocean is yet to be seen. But my particular focus is on the Chagos Archipelago and how it affects India's foreign policy objectives and national interests. So when I speak about the Chagos Archipelago, it is also, but I don't know if you have heard of the Pelindaba Treaty, but the Pelindaba Treaties, that is a nuclear prohibition treaty on any of the Europeans, African soil. So if the sovereignty of Chagos happens to go back to Mauritius again, how the United Kingdom is negotiating under the conservative government. If that happens, there is allegation that there are nuclear weapons on the island of Diego Garcia. If that happens and that territory becomes a part of the African continent, given the fact that it will become a part of Mauritius, then there might be issues with hosting nuclear weapons on the island of Diego Garcia. But Article number 4 in the Pelindaba Treaty allows nuclear weapons delivery systems such as submarines to pass through those islands. Again, India does not have the third leg of the nuclear deterrent. There are reports that there is one third leg of the nuclear deterrent, the S2 ballistic missile delivery system, but many reports suggest that it is not completely operational. So that is the gist of my argument, that India is seeking its preeminence in the Indian Ocean by externally balancing the rise of China in the Indian Ocean by working in partnership with the United States, France, and the United Kingdom.
Okay.
Okay, Brandon,
Oh.
let me just give some comments to both Shahir and Aditya that then we will move towards Rania and Yuan. So then we can conclude it. So just one Aditya for you because you are working on your thesis and then hopefully you will extend this thesis to somewhat in the next level of your work. So one is that you mentioned about the I would just would like to about the structure and the strategies that you are approach that you are using. You mentioned that you are doing the interviews in the qualitative program in the qualitative method. So how many interviews you are going to do with that, and who you are going to interview? That's the one thing. Uh, you can answer this, but I can talk with you separately, but just for this, I want you to take the entry of those people who are very much aligned with with your thesis, their topic, like the political elites, like some defense officials, and some other practitioners who have been working very closely and at very high level of this one. So if you want to go with the interview, like maybe.
Sure.
Mhm.
Right now, I'm referring to secondary interviews, that is, interviews that personally I have not conducted, but they are openly available to me. I have not got the IRB approval from my university to conduct interviews all by myself. But had I got the IRB approval, I would have number one wanted to interview two groups. That is the Chagosian Voices, which is based in the United Kingdom, and the Chagosian Refugee Group. Now, the thing right now which is happening is there are the United Kingdom is trying to negotiate with the Mauritian government to cede sovereignty of the Chagos archipelago back to Mauritius. And there are, as I said in the presentation, two schools of thought. The conservative member of parliament of the United Kingdom, Mr. Kozinski, he is willing to acknowledge the wrongs that have been done to the Chagosians while the excision of Chagos from Mauritius in 1965. But the Chagosian group is, I would say, pro-UK of retaining the sovereignty of Chagos back to the United Kingdom. And the Chagosian refugee group, which has their head office in Mauritius, is wanting the Mauritian government to work and take back the sovereignty back for Mauritius. So when it comes to these, it is about how states are using their subjects or their people to legitimize their claims over the archipelago. Also, in 2010, the United Kingdom declared the Chagos archipelago as a marine protected area. And as one researcher calls it, it is technically the greenwashing of the issue of the entirety of the Chagos, given the fact that they are completely denying the rights of the indigenous Chagosian community from either be it with fishing or with the extracting of minerals, because Chagos being where it is located, just like somewhere around 500 kilometers from Maldives, if the sovereignty of Chagos happens to go back to Mauritius, they get an extended economic zone. And the reason why Maldives opposed the UNGA resolution in 2019 was citing just that. But after the ITLOs, like the International Tribunal for the Law of the Seas, settled in 2023, Maldives is now supporting Mauritius to regain sovereignty over Chagos. So there are currently only 5 states that are opposing Mauritian sovereignty claims over Chagos. That is the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Hungary, and Israel. So if I had to interview people or subjects, I would have interviewed Chagosians or groups that represent Chagosians, but not politicians, because quite a lot of things that politicians have to say are openly available to me through parliamentary debates and through open source government documents through via Hansard for the United Kingdom and through the Ministry of External Affairs of India.
Okay, all right. We can talk it separately because due to the time constraint, we can't talk more here. About because most of the work you are looking to the India's strategic viewpoint towards that, right? Your work is so that. How do you see that India's strategic dilemma? And you said that Nehruvian policy and the ideological India's one part is India supporting that, and another part when it comes to the United States and all the other European partners. So maybe there is a strategic dilemma for India too. So you can somewhere you can find this approach, and you can find this kind of concept. You want to address this or or more on this, looking at the India's viewpoint, looking at the China's role in the Western Indian Ocean, and how they have to compete with the in that region with the Mauritius, and then we all know that about the Mauritius new government and all these things. This keep changing all the time. So fantastic presentation, and then we can talk more on this. And Shahir, just I would like to say that good thought, and you have a lot of content in this paper, but again, then you have to structure it, right? You have to make your argument, then your evidence, then your explanations, and then your approach, right? So we can you can make it in a good shape. Very good, and thank you for the presentation. Brendan, over to you, please.
It is unfortunate that I can't ask any more questions, but I'll close it off for now. I just wanted to remind everybody that's on the audience that all the opinions, data, information that was shared during this panel and during the conference are our own opinions and do not reflect on any official stances of any academic, government, or military organization that any of us represent. I want to thank the panelists again. It was wonderful to talk to you guys. The insights that you guys provided is something different from what I hear on a daily basis. So very interesting. Hopefully I can talk to you guys again soon. But for the audience, thank you for listening to the student panel for the Alliance for the Consortium for Indo-Pacific Researchers, Alliances and Partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, Elevating Strategies and Interests conference. Then again, I am Brennan Donnelly. Thank you for attending, and hopefully we'll catch you at the next panel in the next couple of days. Have a good day. Thank you.